Assalamu alaikum and welcome back once again to Today in African History with Baba Shaka. I'm Baba Shaka and today is April 28th, 2021. And it was on this date, April 28th, back in 1941, that one of our ancestors, Congressman Arthur Mitchell, Democrat from Illinois, successfully argues to the U.S. Supreme Court that Africans in America were entitled to interstate railroad accommodations equal to that of white passengers. Now, before we dig into our subject, I want to take this time to wish all of my Muslim brothers and sisters around the world a blessed Ramadan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your fast, reward your good deeds, and wipe away all of your misdeeds, inshallah. Also, if you will, please take this time to hit that subscribe button just below the screen and bless us with your much needed support. Now, the first African elected to Congress as a Democrat, Arthur Mitchell served 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, illustrating a shift among black voters who traditionally back Republican candidates. Throughout his congressional career, Congressman Mitchell faithfully supported President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal legislation that attracted many black voters during the Great Depression. As the only black representative between 1935 and 1943, Congressman Mitchell was expected by Africans in the Chicago district and across the country to use his political power to represent his race. Despite the pressure that he faced to combat discrimination and promote civil rights, the Illinois representative remarked upon taking office, quote, "I don't plan to spend my time fighting out the question of whether a Negro may eat his lunch at the Capitol or whether he may be shaved in the House barbershop," unquote, an approach he adhered to during his tenure in Congress. The son of former enslaved Taylor Mitchell and Amar Patterson, Arthur Wergs Mitchell was born on a farm near Lafayette, Alabama on December 22nd, 1883. He attended public schools and entered Tuskegee Institute in 1897, working his way through college as a farm laborer and an assistant to Booker T. Washington. He taught in rural schools in Georgia and Alabama and attempted to put Washington's theories on farm management and land ownership into practice by founding the Armstrong Agricultural School in West Butler, Alabama. He served as president of the institution for 10 years before being admitted to the bar in Washington, D.C. in 1927. Mr. Mitchell attended both Columbia and Harvard before he took the bar exam. He practiced law in the nation's capital, and when he moved to Chicago in 1929, he continued his career as an attorney while also becoming involved in the real estate business. Mr. Mitchell married Eula May King, who unfortunately died in 1910, and then Annie Harris, who died in 1947. And 1 year after the death of his second wife, he married Clara Smith Mann. He had one son, Arthur Wergs Mitchell Jr., with his second wife. Mr. Mitchell entered politics as a Republican, but like many Africans in America, shifted his allegiance to the Democratic Party in the early days of the New Deal. In the 1934 Democratic primary for the majority African American congressional district encompassing Chicago's South Side, Mr. Mitchell squared off against Harry Baker, who he lost to by fewer than 1,000 votes. But Baker died before the general election, and party leaders in the district selected Mitchell to take his place. The congressional campaign between Mitchell and Oscar DePriest garnered national attention because both the challenger and the incumbent were African. Mr. Mitchell turned the contest against the venerable Republican representative into a referendum on President Franklin D. Roosevelt's public relief policies. Capitalizing on growing support for the New Deal, Mr. Mitchell orchestrated an aggressive campaign that forced DePriest to defend the Republican Party, whose influence was waning locally, in part due to Chicago Democratic Mayor Edward J. Kelly, who actively courted African voters. On November 6, 1934, Mitchell narrowly beat DePriest, becoming the first African Democrat elected to Congress. In his 3 consecutive elections, Congressman Mitchell continued to win by a slim margin, defeating DePriest again in 1936, future Representative William Dawson 2 years later, and former Illinois State Senator William E. King in 1940, with an average of 53% of the vote. Shortly after taking a seat in the 74th Congress on January 3rd, 1935, Congressman Mitchell reiterated one of his campaign promises. Quote, "What I'm interested in is to help this grand president of ours feed the hungry and clothe the naked and provide work for the idle of every race and creed." Unquote. Congressman Mitchell was assigned to the Committee on the Post Office and Post Roads and retained his permission throughout his 8 years in the House. Right. During his congressional career, the congressman remained a loyal supporter of President Roosevelt and the New Deal. In 1936, the Illinois representative gave a seconding speech for Roosevelt's renomination at the Democratic Convention and served as Western Director of Minority Affairs for the president's re-election campaign. As one of Roosevelt's consistent backers, Congressman Mitchell maintained that the New Deal addressed many of the problems faced by, quote, "America's largest and most neglected minority group," unquote, the black populace. Citing programs such as the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, and the Public Works Administration, the PWA, Congressman Mitchell praised the president's economic answer to the Depression, noting that the New Deal had produced the best conditions for Africans in America since they became free citizens. The WPA constructed thousands of massive public works projects, including buildings, roads, bridges, and airports, and oversaw such diverse activities as the Federal Arts Project and the Federal Writers Project. Led by Harry Hopkins, the agency went to great lengths to treat blacks equally, because after 1936, blacks made up 15 to 20% of the workforce, and through wages and public works initiatives, brought millions of federal dollars to devastated African communities. Likewise, under the direction of Harold Ickes, the PWA hired many Africans in America to help construct public buildings worth millions of dollars in economically depressed black locales. Congressman Mitchell also defended Roosevelt's controversial plan to reorganize the federal judiciary in 1937, noting that Africans had been victimized over the years by unfavorable Supreme Court rulings, and charged that the court had often used the 14th Amendment to protect large corporations and property holders instead of using it as it was intended to defend the citizenship rights of Africans. Sounds like nothing has changed. Okay. Now, while in Congress, Mitchell worked to provide opportunities for Africans in America. Like his predecessor, DePriest, he nominated a number of black candidates to the United States military academies. Congressman Mitchell also used his position to draw attention to racial discrimination. He challenged several labor unions for agreeing to contracts that excluded Africans and supported legislation that would outlaw the poll tax. During the Second World War, Congressman Mitchell criticized the treatment of black soldiers, remarking that the discrimination endured by African troops undermined the U.S. objective, quote, "to extend and protect the doctrines of genuine democracy," unquote. Congressman Mitchell also repeatedly offered bills that would outlaw racial discrimination in civil service. Calling the requirements of submitting a photograph for civil service job applications, quote unquote, racial discrimination, the congressman proposed that fingerprints be used instead. As the only African in Congress, Mr. Mitchell found himself scrutinized by black leaders and organizations across the country. Criticized for what some perceive as his overly cautious stance towards civil rights, Congressman Mitchell was accused of squandering an opportunity to make a significant legislative impact on behalf of his race. A major point of contention was an anti-lynching bill submitted by Mitchell that was considered too lenient by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, and other civil rights groups. When the House ultimately rejected his measure in favor of one with stricter penalties for offenders, Mr. Mitchell remarked, quote, "The authorship of this bill means absolutely nothing as compared with the importance of its passage," unquote. Although Mitchell resented claims he could do more to help Africans in America, he did not want to be identified solely by his race. Quote, I'm not going into Congress as a Negro with a chip on my shoulder thinking I'm of an inferior race and that every man's hand is against me, unquote. He commented shortly after his election to the House. Quote, I'm going in as an American citizen entitled to my rights, no more and no less, and I shall insist upon them. I'm going as the representative of all the people of my district, unquote. Mhm. During his 4 terms in Congress, Mitchell worked closely with many of his white colleagues, adopting a philosophy rooted in cooperation and patience, much like his mentor Booker T. Washington, whom the congressman hoped to honor by establishing a national shrine. Ironically, Mitchell's greatest contribution to desegregation arguably transpired outside the halls of Congress. In April 1937, Congressman Mitchell traveled from Chicago to Hot Springs, Arkansas on the Chicago Rock Island and Pacific Railroad. When the train crossed into Arkansas, a conductor forced the congressman out of the Pullman car for which he had 2 first-class tickets. The representative rode the rest of the journey in a car designated for African passengers that he described as, quote, filthy and foul smelling, unquote. Following in the footsteps of James E. O'Hara, an African Reconstruction era representative, Mitchell challenged transport segregation. He sued the railroad and filed a complaint with the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, contending that interstate trains should be exempt from the Arkansas law requiring quote-unquote separate but equal train accommodations. After the ICC and a federal district court dismissed his complaint, Mr. Mitchell made his history by joining a select number of sitting members of Congress to argue a case before the Supreme Court. On April 28, this date, in 1941, the High Court unanimously held in Mitchell versus United States et al. That black passengers had the right to the same accommodations and treatment whites did. Congressman Mitchell hailed the decision as a, quote, a step in the destruction of Mr. Jim Crow himself, unquote. But the ICC did not prohibit segregation on interstate trains or buses or in the public waiting rooms of railroad or bus stations until 1955. Now, under the circumstances his biographer described as quote-unquote ambiguous, the congressman declined to run for renomination to the 78th Congress in 1942. Officials in Mayor Kelly's Chicago political organization were angry that Mitchell had defied machine orders in pursuing his lawsuit against a Chicago-based rail company and let the congressman know that they planned to withdraw their support. Democratic officials chose his rival, William Dawson, partially because they believed he would be a better candidate against a potentially tough field of Africans on the Republican side. Publicly, Mitchell gracefully accepted his political downfall, claiming, somewhat truthfully, that he was ready for a new phase in his public service career and that he preferred to improve race relations by working through groups active in the South. So after retiring from the House in January of 1943, he moved to Petersburg, Virginia, where he had bought a large tract of land and devoted himself to farming, lecturing, and the activities of organizations such as the Southern Regional Council. Congressman Arthur Works Mitchell died in Petersburg on May 9, 1968. Thank you to all of our subscribers. Your continued support is and has been invaluable. Please like and leave a comment down in the comment section. But most importantly, please share, especially with the young amongst us. So, until tomorrow, inshallah, this is Baba Shaka with Today in African History. Masalam.